Well, we're going to get to this, the last 4 years. Here's what I did in the Christmas series. If I had 8, if the weather, which only happened once or twice, if the weather permitted me to have 8 messages between Thanksgiving and Christmas, I had 2 on Mary, I had 2 on Joseph, I had 2 on the shepherds, and 2 on the wise men. And the first one would tell some of the story. The second one, like in the first one on Mary, we taught that she found favor with God. That's what the angel said. You are highly favored of God. And then the second one of Mary, I talked about what having God's favor meant for her. She could have been stoned to death because she was pregnant before she was married. And in those days, you could have been stoned to death for it. And so having the favor of God was a dangerous thing for Mary. But, of course, God had his hand in it, so nobody was going to hurt Mary. But, and so we would have 2 sides to everything. The dreams that Joseph had on the first one, and how he immediately obeyed them in the second one. And then 2 on the shepherds and 2 on the wise men. Because we're doing these other things, we looked at it prophetically the first 3 lessons, the prophecies of Christ. So we're just doing one on each of those 4 stories, Christmas stories. Well, there's 3 actually, because one involves Mary and Joseph. But we will talk about them separately. I mean, obviously, when you're talking about Joseph, you're going to bring Mary in. When you're talking about Mary, you're going to bring Joseph in. So we're going to do 4 of them, but we're going to do them backwards as a countdown. You remember the top 50? When they used to do the top 50 records, they started with number 50 and counted all the way down to the number 1 record that week. And so we're going to actually go backwards in this series. We're going to start with the wise men. And obviously when the wise men were around, before they ever got to Jerusalem, Jesus had already been born. But the story that we want to go into Christmas with is a beautiful story about Mary giving birth to the Son of God. So we'll start backwards. We'll start with the shepherds, or the wise men rather, tonight. Sunday we'll talk about the shepherds. Next week we'll talk about Joseph and Mary, and that'll complete 7 of the 8 lessons if we have time for all 8. And the last one will be, Jesus is God with us. That's what Emmanuel means, God with us. And so we will talk about what that means to us as Christians to have God with us. So that's the direction we're going for the final 5 of the 8. So here's number 4. 3 wise men, these wise men rather. By the way, we always talk about the 3 wise men. The Bible never tells us how many wise men there were. There could have been a number of them. We don't know. We always say 3. We never try to number the shepherds. But the reason we want to say 3 wise men is because the wise men brought 3 gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And so because there were... Pardon me?
You didn't pray.
Oh, well, I haven't officially started yet. I'm building up.
Oh, okay.
But God's Word is inspired already, whether I pray or not.
Okay.
But nonetheless, Lord, thank you for your Word. Amen.
That's right.
But we don't know how many wise men. We have no idea how many shepherds, but we don't try to number the shepherds. But because there were the wise men got together and brought 3 very expensive gifts, we decided, for all of our songwriting and whatever, to talk about 3 wise men. We simply don't know. There could have been 7, could have been 8, could have been 2 who brought 3 gifts. We don't know. So it never does tell us. But I said that because when I was looking at my title, I mistook the word these for three, and I thought, well, I shouldn't be putting three wise men down. But these wise men knew a thing or two, and we're going to talk about them this evening. Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 to 12, talk about the wise men. Verse 1, Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem. Now wise men, remember the New Testament was written in Greek, and those words refer not to lecturers, not to people who stand up and lecture us, like maybe Aristotle and others did back in the day, but it's a priestly caste among the Persians and Medes, which occupied itself primarily with the secrets of nature, astrology, and medicine. So way back then, a couple thousand years ago, this was a group of people who looked to books, looked to the stars, looked to anything they thought they could divine information from to give them the secrets they needed in various areas, whether it be nature, astrology, or medicine. Daniel, in the prophecy, the book of Daniel is the fifth major prophet. In the Old Testament ends with 17 books about 17 prophets. And when I say about, these are prophecies. Now Daniel actually tells some stories as well. But Jeremiah, you're going to read mostly about Jeremiah's prophecies. So there were five, what they call the five major prophets. And Daniel was the fifth and the smallest of the major prophets, only 12 chapters in Daniel. And then you get into the 12 minor prophets. And Daniel's a pretty amazing guy. And there's certain things about Daniel that replicate the story of Joseph in Egypt. Pharaoh had a dream that disturbed him, and none of his wise men could interpret it. A guy who had been released from prison, now Daniel was in prison because the wife of his brother sold him into slavery because they were envious of Joseph because he was the most loved by the father. You know what the brothers went around doing all the time, Barbie? Saying everybody loves Joseph. Pretty much. And so they sold him, you heard the story of Joseph in the coat of many colors. And so they sold him into slavery to a caravan going to Egypt. And when he got into Egypt, a man named Potiphar bought him as a slave. And he was so faithful in everything he did to wherever he was at, soon Potiphar made him the head of all the other slaves. And his wife looked at him and thought, Potiphar's wife looked at him and said, oh, he's kind of cute, and made a pass at him. But Joseph was head over heels in love with God, not interested in sinning against God. And so, you know what he did when the woman made a pass at him? Literally, he turned around and ran. He didn't sit there and think about it. He turned around and ran. She tried to grab him when he took off in some small piece of clothing. I don't remember what it was. And she had it in her hand. So when Potiphar came back, she made up a story because he made her mad. Joseph did. And said, he tried to rape me. So Potiphar threw him in prison. But just as he became one of the slaves and ended up the head slave in Potiphar's house, he was soon the head prisoner. In other words, you had the guards, but when it came to prisoners, Daniel was the highest ranked. And there were a couple of of the king's men in prison, and they had dreams, and he told them both what it meant. The king had them both thrown in jail. He said to the first one, in so many days, the king's going to take you out and execute you. He told the other one, the king's going to take you out and restore you to your old position. And when he does, mention me to him. So the first one, sure enough, died. The second one got out, was so thrilled, he forgot Daniel. Not intentional, he was just thrilled and forgot Daniel. Pharaoh had this dream nobody could interpret. And the guy said, I know a man. And he said, bring him. And so Daniel was taken out of prison, interpreted the dream. It was an amazing prophetic dream that talked about the head of gold and so forth from Nebuchadnezzar to the Antichrist, basically.
That was Daniel.
What?
That was Daniel.
That was who?
That was Daniel.
Yeah, that's who I'm out on.
You're on Joseph.
No, I'm talking about Daniel because I'm ready to read from Daniel. I might have mentioned Joseph, but Joseph. It was Dan. No, it was Joseph who run from the wife. I mixed the two stories up. All right. I hope you get that on camera. Yeah, Daniel. No, in Daniel's case, they were just going to kill all the wise men because they couldn't interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And Daniel said, tell him not to do that. Give me one night. I'll ask the Lord to give me the dream. And I'll tell him what he dreamed. Because he refused to tell him what he dreamed. Because he thought they'd just make up a false interpretation to stay alive. He was going to kill them all. And so he thought, I got nothing to lose. And so Daniel prayed. God gave him the same dream. He went to... make sure I get the right king here, not Pharaoh, but to Nebuchadnezzar, and told him the exact dream and what it meant. And Nebuchadnezzar, here's where the similarities are. They were both, Joseph by Pharaoh was made second most powerful man in Egypt behind only Pharaoh. Daniel was placed above all the wise men of Nebuchadnezzar. So he had a lot of authority after interpreting the dream. So here's what it said in Daniel 2:48. Then the king made Daniel a great man and gave him many great gifts and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. He basically did the same thing. He pretty much made him second in command. So God had liked that script with Joseph, so he followed it again with Daniel. Now, what a wise man. In the same, I'm quoting a Greek scholar that comments on the scriptures, Robertson. He said it is the same word as our magician. And it sometimes carried the idea, as in the case of Simon Magus in Acts chapter 8, and of Elymas Bar Jesus in Acts chapter 13. These were magicians in Paul's day. And but here in Matthew, the idea seems to rather be that of astrologers. Babylon was the home of astrology, but we only know that the men were from the east, rather Arabia, Babylon, Persia, or elsewhere. So we don't know for certain where they come from. We do know for certain that they were east of Jerusalem. That we know. And so, could have been Babylon, but as the note says, they were into astrologers. So it could have been, because it seemed that the wise men mentioned in the Bible looked heavenward at the stars. And while doing that, they discovered this unusual star. So, who do we think they are? There's some comments for you there, some bullet points. I've They came from the land east of Jerusalem. That's all we really know about that. Might have been Babylon, don't know for sure. They appeared to be from a group who studied various sciences, including astrology, which is important here because it was a star they ended up following. And they were intentionally journeying to Jerusalem. Verse 2 of Matthew chapter 2 said they came from the east of Jerusalem. When they got there, they saying, "Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and are come to worship him." Now, here's an amazing thing. They're not Jews. They're coming to worship the King of the Jews. So they know there's something unusual. Now, some commentators believe that in their journeys, they had been there before, and at that time, many Jews were looking for the coming Messiah. They were wanting a mighty general who would put together an army and defeat Rome and get Rome off their backs. They weren't looking for a little baby in a stable. But Herod, the king, wasn't real happy about this report. So, we're not going to cover every point there, but take those home. There's a lot of really good points. All we know again is a star appeared to them in the east. People say if it was a star in the east, why'd they travel west? They were east of Jerusalem, which means they were traveling west. But all that seems to typify is they seen the star when they were home, east of Jerusalem. And if you see the star and you have decided that this star is in reference to the King of the Jews, you're going to travel to the capital, Jerusalem. So they traveled west. So, in that sense, you get a picture that the star had to kind of move with them. Of course, you know how stars are. You can drive 100 miles and they seem to be, because they're up so high, they seem to be right out the window where they were when it started. And I have no idea how far this trip was nor how long it took them to travel. It just jumps from verse 1 to verse 2, they arrive in Jerusalem. Now, look at verse 3. When Herod the king had heard these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. That's the King James. The contemporary English version of that same verse. When King Herod heard about this, he was worried, and so was everyone else in Jerusalem. Easy to read version. When King Herod heard about this, it upset him, as well as everyone else in Jerusalem. Good News Bible, when King Herod heard about this, he was very upset. And so was everyone else in Jerusalem. And finally, the translation called God's Word, when King Herod and all Jerusalem heard about this, they became disturbed. Now, he was troubled, according to the commentator Albert Barnes. Herod had obtained the kingdom by great crimes and by shedding much blood. He was therefore easily alarmed by any remarkable appearances, and the fact that this star appeared and that it was regarded as proof that a king of the Jews was born alarmed him. Besides, it was a common expectation that the Messiah was about to appear, and he feared that his reign was about to come to an end. All right, that's why he worried. Why did all Jerusalem worry with him? Obviously, they were looking for a coming Messiah. They should have been excited. Well, not really. They knew if King Herod was worried, they got something to worry about. Because when King Herod worried, people started dying. That was his answer to whatever perplexed him, kill some folk. And if you're familiar with the story of Jesus being born, you know that Herod tried to kill him. But it's pretty hard. Not only couldn't the devil defeat this child dressed in swaddling clothes, neither could King Herod. So, hey, there's another verse right there, right? But anyway, I need to write more new songs to stay ahead of Jason there. But verse 4, down at the bottom, when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he demanded of them where Christ should be born. The wise men were looking for him. He thought, well, if this is somebody that's prophesied about in the Old Testament, these guys will know who it is and where he's born. So he called them there. These wise men didn't have the trouble with the other couple of stories we just related to you, because they had an Old Testament to turn to. And so they said unto him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet. And then they quote the prophet, and thou, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the princes of Judah, for out of thee shall come a governor that shall rule my people Israel. The easy to read version, and this is a quote from the prophet Micah down below you, Micah 5:2. And that the wise men of Herod found, and they want to find information for him because they don't want to die. And so the easy to read version renders that Bethlehem in the land of Judah, you are important among the rulers of Judah. Yes, a ruler will come from you, and that ruler will lead Israel, my people. Now Micah 5:2, but thou, Bethlehem Ephratah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall he come forth unto me, that is to be ruler in Israel, whose going forth have been from old, from everlasting. So the prophet Micah said something in his prophecy. You're just a little bitty city here. You're not one of the big cities of Israel. Just a little community. But next to Jerusalem, if you asked, there's always people going on cruises to Israel. Some preacher will be heading it up. I bet if you ask Christians and Jews that live in America, the place they want to see most, it would either be Bethlehem or Jerusalem. Now, to me, it would be Bethlehem. But Jerusalem's where the temple was, and so perhaps the Jewish Americans would want to see Jerusalem a little more. But most likely, you're going to see both of them on a tour. So Bethlehem is a small place, but it's a very important place, whether you're a Jew, a Christian, or a Muslim. Whichever of those three you are. The Muslims don't believe Jesus is God, but they do believe he's a prophet. And inferior to Muhammad, but still a great prophet. And so they're very interested in Bethlehem. So Bethlehem was prophesied by Micah. You might be small, but you're going to become very, very important. And here's why. Somebody who's had this appointment from forever backwards. That's what he's saying there in Micah. He's going to be a ruler in Israel. His going forth have been from old, from everlasting. That's saying, as far that way, if this is forward in eternity, as far that way as you can go backwards in eternity, that's how long this guy's been around. Forever and ever and ever. Micah prophesied this coming king would rule Jerusalem. That is still a future fulfillment. Jesus never ruled Israel or Jerusalem when he was here. But I read that he's coming back. And he's coming back in power. And he's going to have a brand new Jerusalem, get this, that he's bringing with him. Jerusalem overseas, pretty nice place. Might be fit for a king, but it's not fit for this king. So he's bringing one with him. Isn't that amazing? a city 1,200 rather, or 1,400, I forget. 1,400 miles that way, in other words, wide, 1,400 miles long, and 1,400 miles tall. And if you're in that city up there, you won't even need a mask and oxygen. Because you're going to be up there, there's going to be other people still being born down around the city that have to have oxygen to breathe. But you and I, they get to go up there or something. We've already received our glorified bodies. We don't need no oxygen. So I never thought of that ever before till just the night when the prophet said he's going to rule Jerusalem. He didn't do it when he was here, which means it's the future prophecy, and it's not going to be the Jerusalem currently sitting over there in the Middle East. He's bringing a brand new one with him. You can read about it in the book of Revelation. It's going to be a city like no city this planet has ever saw. And it's going to be amazing. And he's going to rule not just Jerusalem, but for 1,000 years, he's going to rule the entire world with an iron fist. And then, he needs the iron fist because there are still people being born who aren't following him. When I say an iron fist, here's what I mean. None of these guys will go into a Walgreens with a shopping cart and fill it up and walk out the door. Won't happen when Jesus is there. And the book of Revelation says that we Christians are going to rule with him with an iron fist. Nobody gets to break the rules. Nobody. Because of that, the devil is bound for 1,000 years in the bottomless pit. Because of that, when the devil is let loose, he's got all kinds of people that have been under the thumb of Christ who don't want to follow him, that he can entice to revolt. And there'll be one final battle after the end of the 1,000 years. And then true peace will come. There'll never be another battle. And that battle, when God's in the battle, it's not really a battle. Let me say that again. When God's in the battle, it's not really a battle. God just speaks the word and it's over. When Jesus comes again, the prophet John in the book of Revelation sees him as having a sword come out of his mouth. In other words, his weapon is his word. He says, and it happens. How do you defeat that? You don't. So that's the amazing story. So verse 7, Herod, when he was privately called the wise men, and inquired of them what time the star appeared, and then he sent them to Bethlehem with a lie, go search diligently for the young child. When you have found him, bring me word again so I may come and worship him. Of course, he wanted to kill him. So at the time, the wise men, I suppose, thought he ought to be happy, Herod ought to be happy about this. But when you're a corrupt king, all you have to do is read the papers every day and you see what power does to people. It corrupts them. There's an old saying that I've quoted over and over and over and over again. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Power has corrupted our politicians for decades. And when you allow that to happen, you get an insatiable desire for more power. And the government just wants us to shut up and do what we're told. And we'll see where that goes. I have no predictions for what's going to happen next. But again, you'll see down here in verse 8, after he said, go and find the child and come and tell me. I put down there, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Verse 9, when they had heard the king, they departed And lo, the star which they saw in the east went before them till it came and stood over where the young child was. Now, this ain't just any star anymore. They were astrologists at first. They were reading things in the sky. There are people who claim, if you follow astronomy, a different kind of reading the stars, you'll know when to plant your crop. They'll tell you when to plant your potatoes. This star, initially, in my mind, just became a sign to them that they had somehow, when they had heard the stories of a coming king of Israel, had somehow gotten this idea, this is how we will be able to tell by looking up. And because God wanted them to know, He probably manipulated those stars so they found the sign they were looking for. So they see a star up here, and it tells them to go to Jerusalem. Now, they probably knew the way to Jerusalem. But when they get to Jerusalem, the star disappears, and so they go in and ask Herod, and Herod asks his wise men, and they find out they need to go to Bethlehem, and now the star becomes a unique star. Now the star appears to them and comes and stands over a stable. There's never been a star up there that any one of us have ever saw, ever, that pointed out a building. Never happened. So, this was a unique star. Can you imagine? This had to even blow the wise men away. Now, we love the manger scene, but the wise men were probably a couple years late for the manger scene. The Bible says they found him in a house, not a stable. Jesus was 2 years old, probably. We don't know for sure. We know he'd already been to Jerusalem. He was not in the stable. His parents, when he was the right age, took him to Jerusalem to be dedicated in the temple of God, like all Jewish families did. Took him to be circumcised, probably at 8 days old. Took him another time, and a couple prophets in the temple prophesied over him. We know he wasn't, we have a pretty good idea, I shouldn't say we know, he wasn't over 2. But he wasn't in the stable. He was in a house. Joseph and Mary moved there for a while. And all of a sudden the wise men come up to Bethlehem, and they find him, and his star is pointing to a house. Now, I don't want to mess up your beautiful manger scenes. You can put the star anywhere you want. But if you want to find the child, none of us know where the house was other than it was in Bethlehem. That's all we know. And we know that when they found the child, they worshipped him, offered 3 gifts to him, very costly gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. 2 kinds of expensive perfume, and of course gold has been precious throughout the history of mankind. And probably because that night God set this up in the mind of the wise men, because that very night when Herod finds out the wise men aren't coming back, we remember Bethlehem was only 7 miles from Jerusalem. When the wise men did not return in the right amount of time to Herod, he sent his soldiers and swords to go kill every boy, little baby boy, 2 and under. Every baby boy 2 and under in Bethlehem died that night. Every one. You say, not Jesus. He was no longer in Bethlehem. God spoke to Joseph the way he spoke to Joseph often in a dream, and said, get up, take the child. Herod wishes to kill him. Go to Egypt. So now all of a sudden, they've got gold, they've got frankincense, and they've got myrrh to sell when they get to Egypt, and set them up for a pretty long time until God tells them, Joseph in another dream, to move back to Israel again. So it's an interesting story, the story of the wise men. We don't know, this is the way I see it, and I just see that when they heard the story in Jerusalem, the very first time that there was a king, they were expecting a coming king, they had this methodology of looking at the stars and believing the stars pointed out important things. And God used that curiosity of the wise men to get their attention, because they were going to finance Mary and Joseph and Jesus' not only trip to Egypt, but their stay there. And so they seen something in the stars that spoke to them. And they traveled west to Jerusalem, talked to Herod, traveled 7 miles further to Bethlehem, found the child in a house. Then the Spirit of God told the wise men, don't go back and tell Herod, he's up to no good. So they went home a different way. And while he's telling the wise men that, he's telling Joseph in a dream, wake up, take the child and his mother, and go. So the happy ending of this story is Jesus survives the quest of the devil and Herod to kill him that night. That's the good news. The bad news is there were some small Jewish boys, 2 and under, that didn't survive.